started. Goati kaitawa haupa tu shanome kutu tuwitsa koheo hano eshwashka washti. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in our AIANTA webinar. The American Indian Alaska Native Tourism Association webinar series today is the Native Chefs Explore Food Sovereignty with Vincent Medina, Louis Trevino, who co-founded the mahk-am-haam Café Ohlone restaurant. We also have our partners with us today, Naomi Torres, who's the superintendent of the Juan Bautista de Anza National Historical Trail. For those of you who are not familiar with AIANTA, for nearly 2 decades, AIANTA has served as the national voice for the American Indian nations engaged in cultural tourism. In addition to serving as the voice for Indian country tourism, AIANTA provides technical assistance and training to tribal nations and Native-owned enterprises engaged in tourism, hospitality, and recreation. AIANTA's mission is to define, introduce, grow, and sustain American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian tourism that honors traditions and values. In addition to webinars like this, in partnership with the George Washington University International Institute of Tourism Studies, AIANTA presents an online cultural heritage certificate program designed to help tourism professionals and tribal planners hone their cultural tourism skills. This year's course began on January 11th and will end on February 28th. It is a 7-week course, and for those of you who are interested, please do sign up for our newsletter on our website at www.aianta.org to get more information for next year's cohorts. AIANTA also provides educational opportunities for tribes through our annual American Indian Tourism Conference, or AITC. The 2021 AITC event will be held in Fort McDowell, Arizona at the Wekopaw Casino Resort on October 25th through the 28th of this year. Again, please visit our website at aianta.org to learn more about our education program offerings and at aianta.org/AITC for additional information and registration for the 23rd Annual American Indian Conference. In partnership with the Juan Bautista de Anza National Historic Trail, again, thank you for joining us as we learn from Native chefs Vincent Medina and Louis Trevino, who co-own the mahk-am-haam Café Ohlone in the San Francisco and Monterey Bay area. Mahk-am-haam means our food in Chochenyo Ohlone language. Vincent and Louis will discuss Ohlone culture, past and present, their menu of Ohlone-inspired foods, and how the COVID-19 pandemic has affected their place of business, as well as their plans for COVID-19. You will also hear how they have explored food sovereignty and worked to create beautiful cuisine. Through their efforts, they dispel negative stereotypes by actively demonstrating the vibrancy and beauty of Ohlone culture, and especially the deep and living connections to their homelands as they celebrate the original culture and cuisine of their beautiful ancient place. Learn how Vincent and Louis have worked hard to understand native plants of their Ohlone homelands along with their traditional uses, and how they have listened attentively to testimony from their elders' recollection of old Indian foods they remember. When we are empowered with food, language, and culture, all while our bodies are strengthening from traditions that make us full, we can achieve a whole lot. From Vincent Medina. So at this time, before we get started, I want to ask the audience a couple of poll questions. So I'm going to launch the poll. And in this first poll, we asked, what type of business do you represent? Are you tribal? Are you tribal cultural heritage, native-owned business, intertribal organization, tour operator, state or federal program? The next question is, are you interested in culinary tourism? Currently operating a food service business that serves native-inspired foods. You want to know more about culinary tourism. The third question is, does your tribe region have native-inspired cuisine? Whether that's a hotel, casino, restaurant, a museum, cultural center restaurant, independent restaurant. I'll give it a few more seconds and then we'll end the polling and I will share the results. Okay, looks like half of the attendees have answered. I'm going to go ahead and end the polling questions right now. And I will share the results. So we have about 29% other that are participating in this webinar today. Are you interested in culinary tourism? 73% want to know more about culinary tourism. And 25% are hotel, casino, restaurants that have inspired cuisine. And actually 38% not yet. Okay, so at this time, I would like to introduce Naomi Torres, again, who is the superintendent of the Juan Bautista de Anza Trail. Please welcome Naomi.
Thank you, Bianca. I'm really pleased to be part of this webinar, and thank you, AIANTA, for organizing this webinar. And I'm also grateful for Vincent and Louis to join us today to present their all the work that they've done. And I'm really grateful to be part of this project. I just want to share a little bit about this project that really centers the Indigenous voices and places along the Anza Trail. On the screen, you have a map of the Anza Expedition, and the Anza Trail commemorates the journey taken by 240 Spanish colonists in 1775-76 from Nogales, Arizona to San Francisco. And although much is known about this Anza Expedition, the colonizing expedition, as part of the National Park Service and the National Trail System, we want to tell a fuller story of these places. These lands were already inhabited by many varied and Native American communities. So a couple of years ago, we entered into a partnership with AIANTA to begin chronicling the stories of the tribes located on or near the Anza Trail, within 100 miles of that corridor. And this 3-year partnership that we have includes educational webinars like this one. And then at the end of this, COVID has delayed this part, and that will be, there'll be an online and a print guidebook that reflects both the past and the present day tribal attractions and key spots along this route. And then additionally, there'll be a map that will translate the key locations along the trail back into original native language. And working with us, AIANTA has engaged travel writer Steve Larice, and he'll be reaching out, if he hasn't reached out already to tribes, is continuing to reach out to tribes to schedule in-person visits when COVID allows. And then during those visits, he'll meet with tribal historians, cultural center and tourism representatives, and other stakeholders, really to share the richness and the story from the tribal perspective. Additionally, we're really excited about this, and that is a cartographer, a very well-respected and known cartographer, Dr. Margaret Pierce, who's Potawatomi. She'll be creating this map, and she's done some beautiful maps and they chronicle the locations along the trail in their original native language. So I'm really grateful that we're able to share this part of the trail, of the lands in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I also invite you, if you are along the route and we've not contacted you, that we invite you to be part of this project. We'd love to hear the stories, and especially current attractions that you're willing to share. And if you'd like to have more information, we'll put a link in the chat to reach out to individuals at AIANTA. And I'm really looking forward to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Vincent Medina, Vincent Medina is East Bay Ohlone and is the captain of Itmay Cultural Association, an association of Verona band cultural bearers. Vincent was born and lives in his family's indigenous tribal area of Hulkin, Southern Oakland, San Leandro, San Lorenzo, Hayward. Vincent and Louis Trevino, who is also the co-founder of mahk-am-haam, an organization and restaurant focused on reviving and strengthening traditional Ohlone foods and sharing them back with their communities. Louis Trevino is a leader in the Rumsen Ohlone community. He is focused primarily on the revitalization of the Rumsen language and traditional Ohlone foods. He longs for a full and holistic renaissance of the life ways of his ancestors, including language, story, song, art, food, and every other aspect of traditional Rumsen Ohlone culture, and he is grateful to contribute to the effort. With his partner, Vincent, Louis co-founded mahk-am-haam, which works to promote traditional Ohlone foods with their families, as well as to educate the public about Ohlone cuisine and identity. So before we get them on, we're gonna go ahead and launch their poll questions. And this is from mahk-am-haam, Café Ohlone. So at this time, you see on your screen, which of the following is a traditional Ohlone ingredient? So you have the choices of bison, corn, acorn, or wild rice. Question 2 is the Ohlone are primarily a blank people, coastal, desert, mountain, or plains. And number 3, historically, there are at least 8 Ohlone languages with several dialects spoken within each. Today, blank Ohlone languages continue to be spoken. So you have some single answer questions and some multiple choice questions here. We'll give it a few seconds before we end the poll and share the results and before Vincent and Louis come on. We have a pretty good turnout here with 94 participants. Yay, this has been the most so far in our webinar series. So we're gonna go ahead and end the polling now. I will share the results. And the answer, so is acorn 50%, and that's the correct answer. We have the Ohlone primary, our coastal people, yes, 65% of you got that correct. And historically there are, or today actually there are 3, so 29% got that correct, languages from the Ohlone. So I'm gonna stop sharing, and at this time, let's welcome Vincent and Louis. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you to AIANTA for opening up the space, for allowing us to share our story with all of you. Before we begin this presentation, I'd like to say to all of you, Orshe tuhi hemmenya, kanak rakat Vincent Medina, at kanak halkin taresh, nesa kanak rote halkin warep, manni maksuyak mehiswi hementuhi, manni maksuyak me isha uyakish, manni maksuyak me isha netuhi, at makushish tak aye. Kanamu ek maknane rakat Louis Trevino, at wakaye Rumsen taresh, at Louis nesa amki emnunu.
Mishiktuch imme mahk-am, karakt Louis Trevino, ka itmai kakon tahoya achistai pire, in karukat chia misi halkin imem takamuish Vincent, chia tai mukyang, in kashunin in imme shatushakai, rote chia imem takamuish.
What Louis and myself just shared in our respective Ohlone languages, the language that I spoke is Chochenyo from here in the East Bay, so the eastern shores of San Francisco Bay. What Louis shared in Rumsen, which is the Ohlone language from Carmel, Monterey, about 100 miles south of where we're speaking from, is good day to you all. We're proud to be able to share some of our story with all of you. We're happy to be able to share some of our story with you. But before we talk about how this work got started, we want to acknowledge the place that we're speaking from, Halkin Warep. which is where my family has always lived and where we continue to be into these modern days, where we'll be in the future as well. Behind me in Louis is an image of Macrume, San Lorenzo Creek, which is just a few blocks away from where we're speaking from. Along the marshes of the bay is where its mouth is at, opening into San Francisco Bay, but starting up in the hills. And this is a creek that has always sustained my family, and we pass by this creek every single day. So this creek and this land has always nurtured us, nurtured these foods, nurtured our family. And we want to acknowledge our elders and of course our ancestors who allow us to be here, allow us to continue to keep our culture strong. And because of their efforts, because of their strength, things can be able to be healed. We can see brighter days from those days of hardship that came with colonization. The truth is that for thousands of years, our people here, as well as indigenous people all throughout these lands, have lived good, meaningful lives. When colonization came, it tried to sever us from our traditional culture and from our lands. But there's much more to this story than colonization. For thousands of years, happiness, love, abundance, sophistication, these have been part of our worlds. Colonization came and it was hard. We'll talk about some of that, but we don't want to stay locked there either, in our view, because we want to work for that future where we know, where we can have the things that we deserve, be able to see our languages, our foods, our identities, our values, our religion, our stories, land stewardship, all those things grow stronger. And because of our elders, because of our ancestors, we know that there's a way to get there. So this work that we're going to talk about, it's about mahk-am-haam, which in Chochenyo language, it means our food. And mahk-am-haam is the nonprofit, the organization that we run that's focused on community work. It's focused on feeding our elders, on providing cultural classes to our younger people and our elders as well, for those who are leaders in teaching, of course, about this work. And also by having gathering trips and communal meals. We'll talk about this in just a moment, and also Café Ohlone. But we'd like to start by sharing a video with all of you so you can see some of this work with your own eyes, and also to see the urbanity of our homeland, the beauty of our homeland, and a little glimpse into where we come from. Thank you, Louis.
It's exciting through mahk-am-haam to bring Ohlone foods to the public here. Every other culture is represented in their cuisine here in the Bay Area. It's important that Ohlone foods are also in that space. By having Ohlone foods here today, it makes it inarguable that we are here.
There's a contemporary phrase that we have, which is makwarap hashe irek, makwarap isha aye. The ground turned to stone, but the world is still alive. You know, we're in the midst of all this urbanity. We got to make sense of our worlds, and it is urban. The ground is stone, and no matter what, you know, you can never separate us from this place either. We're doing what we can, you know, what we have available, and so sometimes that means creating a cafe space in the back of a bookstore. So everybody knows what our menu is today. To start off, we have a rose hip tea and an elderberry tea, a native green salad, and a dressing of walnut oil and blackberry juice. We have soft-boiled quail eggs, acorn soup, one of them with wildflower honey, one of them is left unsweetened, acorn flour brownies. We have venison that's currently being smoked with bay laurel and bay salt from San Francisco Bay shoreline. So, akoit, welcome. Nesa makama. Now let's eat.
Café Ohlone by mahk-am-haam is in this tucked away back patio here at University Press Bookstore. We're across the street from UC Berkeley, surrounded by all of this activity. Louis and myself started mahk-am-haam, which in Chochenyo language, it means our food. It's an organization that we started in order to return our traditional Ohlone foods to our families who haven't experienced them in at least 2 generations. This very place right here could be where our direct ancestors gathered 400 or 500 years ago. And when we're gathering these plants again, it's just getting back into that groove of how our people have always done it. This is a laurel. In our language, we call this sokoti. In Rumsen, sokoch. So right here, this is the charishmin in Chochenyo, charishim in Rumsen, which is the yerba buena. This is a herb that we make into a tea. It's that quintessential taste of home. When I started working there at Mission Dolores, I really did the most that I could to talk about our strength, our survival, our perseverance, and our continuity as well. Eventually, it just reached a boiling point for me where I realized, my time here on Earth can be spent reversing what the mission has done to us. And instead of just talking about those things, this work that we're doing, it's like defying gravity because we're moving against what was supposed to happen. We live in this society right now that's always getting things in an instant, getting food in an instant, whatever we need. And in this like fast food, world that we're living in, slow foods is trying to buck that trend. And that means eating seasonally. People, I don't think, understand how decadent and how rich our diet is. We always say that our food is inherently bougie, because just the ingredients on their own. This is a blackberry, yerba buena, bay laurel dipping sauce. And we will add a little bit of acorn flour to this to thicken it. This is the bay laurel we gathered yesterday. These are quail eggs, atush hexen in our language. These are going to be soft boiled for 3 minutes. And we're going to have roasted venison backstrap that's wrapped in yerba buena. We're going to have Louis's acorn flour brownies, which is something that we made to introduce acorn to our young people. We adapted a brownie recipe to include acorn flour and to use coconut oil rather than butter. For me, I think that our contemporary foods that we're making are foods that our people would recognize because they're rooted in everything that's traditional. We don't cook with anything that wasn't here in those pre-contact days. There is always room for creativity, but we also know that there's rules that we have to follow too. With those rules, that means that we have to be steadfast and making sure that we don't change things too much, because otherwise that changes the nature of what our food is. One moment, please. Stop share. I think it should be. Let's see. Okay, one moment. Looking for our presentation. Yeah, right there. Mm-hmm. All right, thank you, Louis. Okay, so that is about a 5-minute clip of a much longer episode that we worked on with our community with Tending Nature, which is part of KCET, and it is available online. I don't have the link, but if you Google KCET Tending Nature, that will in Ohlone, that will come up, the full episode. But this work that we're doing, we're happy to share some of our story of how we were able to start this and what led us to
to begin to create this organization, mahk-am-haam, and also eventually Café Ohlone that came out of this. And Louis and myself, we both come from old Ohlone families, meaning that our families have always retained culture. Our elders, our ancestors, always found a way to keep our story moving forward, keeping those connections to the land that we come from. And this is a map right here of what Ohlone territory looks like. So if you, this is Central California. If you look at the far left side, that's San Francisco, where the purplish color across the bay is at. That's where my family's from. That's all Chochenyo land. And then if you look down south to where the green area is at, the light green, that's the Rumsen region where Louis's family's from. Now in the old days, we weren't one tribe, but a series of interconnected, sovereign microstates, nations of our own. And traditionally, our people speak 8 different languages in the entire collective Ohlone region. Today, 3 of those Ohlone languages are still spoken. Chochenyo, which is the East Bay Ohlone language, Rumsen, the Monterey area Ohlone language, and Mutsin, which is from Gilroy, San Juan Bautista area. Now, if you take a look even closer, this is an image of the East Bay. And each one of these names that are on here is an independent sovereign nation of its own. So today, these would be referred to as microstates in contemporary usage of the term. And what I mean by that is each one of these names that you see here had their own independence. A region that was relatively small, about 10 miles by 10 miles, but also an independent way of being in the world, but also interconnected with all these other nations around them. Because of the biodiversity of California, that also led to huge amounts of cultural diversity, cultural expression. And many people are just beginning to come to terms with how abundant California in that old world is. What I mean by that is if you could think of 8 different Ohlone languages within a region, but then within that, huge amounts of dialects that are there. We could even say dozens of different dialects. If you take a step even further, within California as a whole, there's over 120 different native languages that are spoken within just the modern day boundaries of California. And that abundance is shaped as well by the land, by this biodiversity that's here that comes from different landscapes, that comes from the desert being down south, with valleys being in the interior, central regions, the coast that's there. If you go up further north, there's huge different ecosystems that are there. And that abundance allowed our people to be able to flourish and live good lives, and also have huge amounts of expression, of seeing the world in different ways. That's something that we still pride ourselves on, even today, as California Indian people. Because what that shows us as well is that in those old days, we know that there was all these different ways of existing, of being, but people still were able to live together in these rich, meaningful ways, to be able to coexist, even if they didn't speak the same language, even if they didn't weave baskets the same way or pray to the same mountain. Even if there was huge cultural differences that were there, people were still able to coexist with all kinds of difference around them and live well, live meaningful lives, happy lives. Today in our community, we still identify as where our families come from in those old days. So I'm a Halkeen person. My family is from the Halkeen area, which is on the central bay shore, going up into the hills, which is right here where we're speaking to you from. Now, our family in this region, we have this unbroken connection to this area, meaning that no generation of our people have ever moved away from here. And that goes all the way back to our creation, where we believe where our world began on the peaks of Tuxtlac, which means the place of the day, which the Spanish named the mountain of the devil, the region around it, because native people ran to there when they were fleeing the missions. Now, that's still our holy mountain. That's still somewhere that we pray to every day. It's still revered in our community. Now, knowing that we've been here for all of this time, for all of these years, all these generations, too many generations to ever count, It means that there's a relationship that's there that's too deep to ever really explain in words. But this land has also protected us. This land has birthed every part of our identity, our language, our stories, our aesthetic, our values, how we see the world. It's our only home. Now, when the Spanish came here, and then Americans later, our family, of course, encountered severe hardships. The Spanish missionaries, they enslaved our direct ancestors at Mission Dolores in what's now San Francisco, and later Mission San Jose, what's now Fremont, about 20 miles south of where we're speaking to you from. And in those places, every single aspect of our traditional culture was under attack. Our language was banned, our religion was banned, families were taken from their villages. It wasn't a choice, as people often in mainstream education will teach. That's starting to change. But for such a long time, it was taught as it was simply a choice that our ancestors made, which was never true. I worked at Mission Dolores for 7 years, where I was trying to work to change how that story was taught there. That's what I was alluding to in that video that was there. And when I was working at Mission Dolores, I was trying to change how people understood the missions so that they understood that those places were hard, that our families suffered in those places, but also that our families survived those places, but that we can't forget the people who didn't survive those places as well, who did nothing wrong, who were simply living in a place that other people wanted to claim for themselves. Now, in those missions, we know that there's still a lingering effect that we feel from those places as well. The fact that we have to work hard to revive our language, to revive food traditions, to be able to reclaim land stewardship practices that were banned. There's been an immense amount that's continued on, but there was disruption that came from those colonial places. When the Anza Trail that Naomi was just mentioning as well, we were discussing that yesterday. And those trails, that Anza Trail, it's on pre-existing indigenous trails, native trails that have long existed, going through homelands that Native people have long lived in and continue to live in as well. And so reframing how we're able to understand place by understanding the Spanish, that they were just here in California for 65 years, that's it. But still looking at the landscape, you still see so much of their presence, the place names that are often there. Even on our last names, you see a presence of that. But we also know that while that's a part of our history, that we want to transcend those mission times as well, to look into a world where we can just be as our ancestors were, keep our culture strong, and see these ways grow stronger with our elders' guidance. This work at Mission Dolores, it created a lot of powerful feelings that I felt, feelings of anger, feelings of frustration, of sadness, because I know, and Louis knows as well, our families know, that what happened wasn't fair, that it wasn't right, that it wasn't just about our families having to go through such hardship. And this is an extension of things that Native people all throughout North America, South America had to endure needlessly, but also knowing that survival is a part of this story too. We like to think of ourselves as working towards a post-mission reality, because even as a child, those missions still had such a hold on our identity. They were one of the few places that we could go to connect, one of the few places that we could go to be able to go into a tangible space that we know that our ancestors built, that wasn't torn down for the sake of development or wasn't removed because it was in the way of white settlement. But those were places that we know that our families survived and also that our family members built. I always wondered though, and I know Louis as well, what that old world was like before the missions, what things were like here before things started to change. And our elders, they always reminded us as young people to be proud of who we come from, to be proud of where we come from, to know our identity. And that always inspired us to be able to carry on our culture as we saw them carry on our culture. Our elders, they could remember hearing our language being spoken when they were young people. They could remember eating these foods that we're about to describe when they were young people. They could remember hearing stories that stretch back to the beginning of the world that were still being passed on from their elders. And when it's all happening right here in the land that's always shaped us, it's easy to see how we can reclaim, work in that model of our elders to be able to see all of this work grow stronger with their guidance. We saw the success of our language be revived, meaning that when Louis and myself were children, both of our Ohlone languages, they weren't being spoken as fluent languages. There were words that were known, and the revival was just in the middle of being started. But our elders, because of how hard that colonization was, not everything could be passed on. But those ancestors of our communities, they recorded countless amounts of pages, collectively, thousands and thousands of pages, tens of thousands of pages collectively, huh? Mm-hmm. And that allows our languages to be able to be revived. Louis and myself, we both spent our adult lives as well as our young adult lives, as well as with our elders in our community to see our language grow stronger. And within about a 10-year process, because of this community work and with our elders leading this, we've been able to see this huge revival where now children are growing up speaking our language. Our elders, they could remember hearing words more and more frequently, and they're leading this work and speaking as much as they can. This led to a storytelling revival, as well as the beginnings of a religious revival, where we were able to see those ways come back into our life as well. Old stories and also religion grow stronger, our traditional religion. And then that made us also feel inspired to be able to work to see these foods grow stronger too. We started by asking our elders about foods that they remembered. And they taught us teas, they taught us foods, they taught us some of the dishes that they ate that we'll talk about in just a moment. And for those things that they couldn't remember, we went through those old archives that were recorded in the 1920s and 30s, again, by ancestors of our communities. And in those archives, it's much more than language, but it's story. It's about jokes that people tell. It's about daily life. People talk about old dances. They talk about regalia. They talk sometimes about gossip here and there. They talk about all these things that make people human. But they also talk extensively about food, about how much they miss that food, about how delicious our traditional Ohlone foods are, about how rich they are, about even recipes on how to make them. This is one of the earliest images of Ohlone people from this area, Miwok people also, I should add. And this painting that's here, this is from 1816 by a Russian artist, Louis Trevino, who painted this lithograph in 1816 at Mission Dolores. Some of these people are from the same villages that our family comes from at the same time that they were there at the mission. So it's easy to see our aunties in this painting as well, even though it was from a long time ago. But it's important to remember the people that we come from, and also to know why it's possible to have this revival because of the ancestors, because of the elders. This is an image of some of the community work that we're doing today. This is from an Acorn gathering trip that we had just a couple of weeks ago. You're going to see we're all masked up because we're trying to stay safe during this time. But this is some of our family together working to keep our traditional food strong over in Livermore. And if you look behind, it's a little hard to see, but just peeking in the very back of those hills, there's a mountain that's rising, and that's Tushtak, that's Mount Diablo. That's where our world began. And as we go out together and we gather, we work to keep these foods strong so that we can be able to empower our young people. And again, make our elders feel happy because they've missed these foods. They missed having these ways around them as well. And it makes us feel proud to be able to see these ways grow stronger. We created Café Ohlone as a result of this community work that we started with mahk-am-haam. So in September of 2017, we created an organization called mahk-am-haam, which again in Chochenyo, it means our food. And we started this because we knew we wanted to work to see our foods grow stronger, but it always has to be a collective thing. We can't be the only ones doing this work. And it always has to be led by the older generation. We started this community work, and immediately we started with a storytelling gathering, and we had 3 nights of camping together where we feasted on traditional foods. Venison, we feasted on acorn, on our native berries, on hazelnuts, on huckleberries, on traditional foods that our family ate long before colonization. And what happened was we saw how much our family loved these foods. They started to crave them. We saw our elders putting acorn soup over every single dish that they had. And we also had some Western foods because we wanted to make this something that people could choose what they wanted to eat. So of course there were some things that were very also familiar, like potato salad and some barbecue. But we saw folks pouring that acorn soup over their potato salad, over their barbecue, eating as much of those traditional foods as they could. And before we ate anything, my little brother, he gave a call, which was recorded at Mission San Jose, which was about melons. And there was an older Ohlone man named Pistachio. Whenever there would be melons that would come to Mission San Jose, he would stand in front of the mission and tell all of the other Ohlone and Miwok people out there, hemmen, 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 hait, 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 erenish, 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 which means everybody get over here, get over here, get over here. There's delicious watermelon to eat right here. And my brother, who has been learning Chochenyo since he's been about 7 years old and now is very comfortable and confident in our language, he gave that call out and everybody came and ate. But instead of watermelon, we had acorn soup. We had that first bite together. And I'll never forget the silence that came over that camp, where everybody just savored it, ate it real slow as this fine thing. And immediately people started going back for more and more. Acorn for such a long time was an inaccessible food to us because we're an urban people. We're our homeland. It's in the middle of the city. And even though there's huge amounts of open space, it's often populated and busy with people who aren't from our community. So people who aren't native themselves. And what that does is this creates feelings of difficulty when we want to go out there and gather, because we're always being watched, it feels like, or we're always having people hovering over us. We want to gather those traditional foods. And up until recently, it was hard to be able to do that until we started to find ways to get permits to do that work, or where we feel safer to do so without being hassled or bothered. But I'll never forget how much love there was there for that traditional food. And then that was how mahk-am-haam got started. Out of this, we started to think, how can we share this work with the public? So we created, quickly, this is the acorn right here. This is how we leach the acorn, because acorn has to be leached. And for those who got acorn right on the poll, wonderful job. And for those who might have guessed something else, now you all know, acorn is the most traditional Ohlone food. It has to be leached for several hours, about 18 hours before it's ready to be made into an edible flour. But once it's leached, it's so sweet and fine and so delicate. It's such a wonderful taste. This is the acorn bread that's here. And the acorn bread, has this wonderful crust on the outside, and the inside, it's like a jelly. It's so good. We started to think of how can we teach the public? Because as an educator at Mission Dolores, I saw how effective it can be to teach the public our story on our terms, meaning not having other people tell our story, but being able to tell our story ourselves from our own voices, our own words. And if we could do this through food, through sharing our culture, through sharing what those old ways were like in a modern setting, to teach people that we've never left, that our connection to this place is unbroken, and that we'll be here in the future as well. we started to think about this, and we created, as a result of mahk-am-haam, we created Café Ohlone, which became the very first Ohlone restaurant in modern times. We say modern times because we don't want to say that there wasn't something like a restaurant 1,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. We weren't there, you know? So we want to be honest and fair and say in modern times, this is the first Ohlone restaurant that exists. But it's definitely something that caught on quickly. And immediately after we opened Café Ohlone, we wanted people to see what modern day Ohlone culture looks like. To know that we're not locked in the past, but that we're modern day people of the 21st century, that we're savvy, that we tweet, that we text, that we listen to contemporary music, but there's also nothing wrong with cherishing and valuing our traditional culture and carrying these ways along with us into the future. And we would often share this through food in different ways. Like for an example, this acorn bread that's in that abalone shell right there. This acorn bread is one of our most traditional dishes that goes all the way back into the ancient, into the creation stories of Louis's family, for an example. And this acorn bread is something that we still make. When it's eaten by our elders, they eat it, again, like such a fine, delicate thing, taking several bites of it just to savor each taste. Here's also a modern day dish with acorn. Louis is an expert on making acorn flour brownies that we introduced, that Louis developed because we wanted our young people, for their first bite of acorn, to be a familiar one. And we were able to source this chocolate from Zapotec chocolate makers, a woman named Doña Margarita, who lives in, what's the pueblo, Louis?
San Dionisio Ocotepec.
San Dionisio Ocotepec in central Mexico. So keeping those relations to our indigenous cousins down south, of course, and also being able to still find a way to bring in an ingredient that's intentional, even if it wasn't native to California 200 years ago, chocolate. We know that when chocolate was introduced here, though, during colonization, it was something that our people took on very quickly. There was a lot of things that were rejected, but chocolate wasn't one of those ingredients that was rejected. So we thought after a little bit of time, we would phase out the acorn flour brownies and just get to the pure acorn. But it turned out that our elders, they love these brownies. They said, don't get rid of them. So we said, okay, we won't. And we keep them. And it also reminds us you could have both. You could have the traditional dish and you could have a modern day dish. That's a living identity right there, being able to have both and being able to do that on our terms. We started to research and look at some of these other dishes. Like there's a Spanish recipe called albóndigas, a Mexican recipe that was introduced during the mission times. But in those old notes that are recorded by Ohlone elders in the 1920s and 30s, it was recorded that whenever there would be venison, deer meat, that instead of making the albóndigas with the chicken or the beef as was traditional, that Ohlone people would Ohloneize it and make the albóndigas with venison instead, to be able to have those traditional flavors. So this is our Café Ohlone albóndigas with deer meat that's bound with amaranth, with dandelion greens, local mushrooms that we gather, a watercress salad, fiddleheads, tea-soaked quail eggs, elderberry tea-soaked quail eggs, as a way to show how rich that traditional way of eating is. Contemporary Ohlone breakfast, we're always happy to share this as well. This is, we always have these huge salads that are all seasonal. Again, Louis is an expert on making these, but this is watercress and redwood sorrel, coyote flowers, blackberries. There's wet roasted hazelnuts, piñons. There's walnuts, black walnuts, blackberry bay laurel coulis that we dress with, we emulsify with some walnut oil to make a dressing. Duck bacon. In the old days, many of our people didn't eat pork as a result of dietary restrictions. The pigs that came to the mission were very unclean. And the old timers, they said not to eat pork because of the pig's uncleanliness here in California. And so as a result, many Ohlone people today don't eat pork still, but we eat a lot of duck. And so that's bacon made out of duck, a modern day touch. There's Indian onions and local mushrooms, hazelnut flour pancakes, Ohlone potatoes, chia seed porridge. We love to share our food, and we say, mahk-am-haam hina pahosi makwarep. Our food, it looks like the land. Just a few images of the cafe, being able to teach people on our terms with our own family, being the leaders in this interpretation. Many Ohlone people don't drink, and we have a huge amount of teas instead to be able to share those values that we hold dear. This is nettle tea that's right here, rose hip teas, rosebud teas, hummingbird sage, black sage, manzanita cider, elderberry. There's so much that's there, and they're also local and rooted. We gathered these right here in the hills. Some of these teas we gathered just in the marshes a few blocks from where we're at. We started to see a lot of visibility that would come. One of these things that started to happen was the San Francisco Chronicle. They named us one of the top 100 restaurants in the Bay Area, which we really appreciate. Soleil Ho, who's the food critic of the Chronicle, she's working right now to be able to lift up voices that have often been underrepresented, which works really well in this time that we're in, where we're being able to amplify messages and people who've often not had our stories amplified. The San Francisco Chronicle, we get a real kick out of this one too, because in the past, they wrote several times about the last Ohlone person who passed, and they kept writing over and over, the last Ohlone person passed. They wrote it in the 1890s, in the 1920s, the last Ohlone person passed, in the 1960s, the last Ohlone person passed. They kept writing that, and the truth is our people just kept existing. We never stopped existing, but they kept trying to write us off. And so to be able to see a whole-scale change with this new food critic and listing us as a top 100 restaurants, that's especially meaningful to us as well. We started to see our food go into places like the New York Times, Bon Appetit magazine, Sunset magazine, places where we're able to change how people understand California cuisine. Because for so long, it would be primarily Anglo-American chefs who would misrepresent what California cuisine is. And what that does, by creating this blank slate, by erasing us out of the equation, and by thinking you can put anything that's local, whether it be a persimmon or an avocado or some goat cheese, as long as it's local and fresh, they say, that's California cuisine. But the truth is that's unfair. That's also racist, because California cuisine isn't those things. California has several existing cuisines that are here long before colonization, based on region. And things like acorn and venison and salmon and huckleberries, those are our native foods from right here where we're at. And that's different than if you go north or south of here. But right here in the Bay Area, this is what it is. And we want people to know that. We started to travel around the world as well to amplify this message. We made this meal for 250 folks in Italy with other native foodies as well, with Slow Foods Turtle Island, and which is a chapter of the Slow Foods International movement, but that's all focused on indigenous chefs and farmers and people who are invested in their food traditions. And so we were able to share with the Italian people our rich foods as well, bringing our message to Italy and sharing how rich traditional foods are from this part of the world. Remembering as well those connections that we have to other indigenous communities. This is the Ainu community of northern Japan. They're also acorn eaters as well. And in 2019, we traveled there with their elders and brought acorn from our elders to their elders. And for many of them, that was their first time in 70 years eating acorn. Many of their oldest generation ate it only when they were children. So to be able to have that flavor again, it reminded us a lot of here at home as well, and how they were affected by colonization, but how they also survived that too. Being able to bring in our culture, these are some of our traditional games. At Café Ohlone, everything is on our system, meaning that we start with a plate for our ancestors. That first plate that's there Our elders get the first bite of food. Community gets to sit at the head of the table. We make sure that all elders, no matter what color they are, what race they are, they get to eat first, because our elders, that's what we're taught, is to always make sure that the older generations get that respect. And also by feeding people with abundance, that's the other thing. We like to feed people how we eat at home, which is where you're like, you walk out bursting, you know, where like you think of our aunties just always putting more food on your plate. And that's how we like to feed people at Café Ohlone. It's at no extra cost. It's just, it's something that we value, is showing our way of generosity, our way of eating, our way of being able to come together. These are some of those traditional games that we have on display. And I'd like to spend a couple of minutes with some Q&A. So just to end right here, you can follow us on Instagram or on Twitter at mahk-am-haam. mahk-am-haam.com is our website. We are surviving throughout the pandemic right now. Our restaurant is closed as a result of COVID, but we're going to reopen once it's safer times. We closed early because we know what it's like with these diseases, contagious diseases in our history. Our people experience several hardships with those. And so our elders, they wanted us to close early, which we did. We closed before there were any statewide mandates, which we're very proud of, because we wanted to keep safe. Of course, human life is always worth more than profit. And we closed early, and now we are operating with meal boxes, beautiful, carefully curated meal boxes that are made from redwood, sustainable redwood here from the East Bay. You can learn more about what we're doing at mahk-am-haam and mahk-am-haam.com. I would like to say again, thank you to AIANTA for opening up this platform. I hope that we can answer a few questions in the next 3 minutes. We're grateful. Makin roket alshi. Thank you very much for your time and for listening.
Thank you so much, Vincent and Louis. Tawa we have a couple minutes for a couple of questions. So from Sandy White here, did the speakers attend culinary school or take culinary classes to help their recipes?
You want to answer that?
Sure. So we don't have culinary training in that way, but we both come from families that prepared food in very specific ways, in very rich ways. So we grew up with a lot of food culture.
Definitely.
Nice. And then everyone is thanking you for sharing your story. We do have one other question. How did your cafe start? At farmers market or a community event?
It started with the community events, and then it turned out that there was this perfect space that was just right behind a bookstore in Berkeley, where we were able to rent a space from, and it became possible for us to have a physical Café Ohlone as a result of that.
And then one more question, well, comment and question. I would love to taste all this good food. When are they cooking for us? Can we buy some of the food? This is from Prudy, Korea.
Thank you, thank you. And we have, if you're in the Bay Area, we have meal boxes once a month right now, and they're contactless. It's like a 9-course Ohlone dinner that's there. Mussels or clams, or last week we did a venison stew with chanterelle mushrooms. It's always rotating based on what's seasonal, but we do it once a month just as a way to keep this message amplified. But we will open up a much larger Café Ohlone post-COVID. And when that happens, it will be here in the East Bay. We hope that those who are in attendance can join us one day as special guests. Let us know if you come, when you come, that you were here at this panel. And we want to thank you all as well for showing that care for the work that we're doing. And also to acknowledge too that all throughout North America, there's folks that are doing this work in their own respective areas. We're very localized right here to our homeland. We're very, very like hyper localized here. But we also know that there's a bigger picture of folks all throughout the country and all throughout the world, in fact, doing work to keep their own respective food strong, which is a beautiful thing when we can all see how our commonalities that we have together.
Okay, we do have a few more questions, but we will forward those questions to Vincent and Louis for them to answer the questions that we weren't able to answer. We will have this live webinar recording posted on our website, and I will email the link to all of our registrants for this webinar. So yes, you will receive the webinar. Also, if you are not a member of AIANTA and you would like to be, please visit our website at aianta.org and sign up for our newsletter as well. You will receive the latest information on the upcoming webinar series that we will have throughout this year. Again, thank you everyone for joining us today. Naomi, in partnership with the Anza Trail, and thank you so much, Vincent and Louis, for this beautiful and wonderful presentation. And we wish you well, and can't wait to get out there and taste that Ohlone food. Thank you all. Tawa.
Stay safe and stay well. Thank you, everybody.